Hello, my name is Barry Horner, and I'm your host on today's episode of Stake and Soul, the podcast that's dedicated to demystifying the world of employee ownership. Stake refers not just to the financial or beneficial ownership, but also the vested interest, the sense of responsibility, and the feeling of belonging that comes with being an employee owner. Soul is all about the company culture, the values, the shared purpose, and the human connection that are amplified and shaped by employee ownership. Soul is the company's silent language. Join me as we sit down with business leaders, dedicated employees, and expert advisors who have successfully navigated their journey to employee ownership, and those who make the EO community thrive every single day. It's a real privilege to introduce Andrew Murphy, the CEO of The Entertainer, who is leading one of the most significant chapters in the history of British retail. Andrew spent over 30 years at the John Lewis Partnership, famously working his way from the shop floor in Aberdeen to becoming the Group Chief Operating Officer. After 3 decades at the UK's most famous employee-owned business, he took a leap into a different world in 2023 to lead The Entertainer, only to oversee its historic transition to employee ownership just 2 years later. For 44 years, The Entertainer was the quintessential family business, founded by Gary and Catherine Grant. In September 2025, the company completed a 100% transfer of its shareholding into an employee ownership trust. The transition turned 1,900 staff members into employee owners. This entitled them to a democratic voice through the new colleague advisory board and a share of the profits via tax-free bonuses. Under Andrew's leadership, The Entertainer has expanded into over 850 Tesco locations and launched partnerships with M&S, Hobbycraft and Carrefour in the UAE. Having spent 30 years with the established John Lewis model, Andrew is now the architect of a new kind of employee ownership at The Entertainer, one that balances the agility of a private firm with the values-driven resilience of a trust. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So maybe a good place to start is John Lewis before we jump into The Entertainer. I'm fascinated by your background, 30 years at John Lewis. Maybe just talk to us a little bit about where you started, how you worked your way up, and where you ended up at John Lewis. And I guess just a few reflections of your time at John Lewis that then led you to leading another significant employee-owned business.
So back in 1992, I was leaving university, and John Lewis had already turned me down for one job as a pot washer in their restaurant in Edinburgh. And I applied again on what they call the milk round, the graduate training scheme. And for various reasons, they turned me down again. But in the letter I received back from them, there were some spelling mistakes and some punctuation errors. So I wrote back and pointed that out and suggested a bit cheekily that perhaps it meant their recruitment processes were slightly flawed, and perhaps I'd been a victim of that same inefficiency. And I'm sure this wouldn't happen now. But somebody obviously took a chance on me and redirected me into the local store, which was John Lewis Aberdeen, where I started on the shop floor in haberdashery. And without really any idea of whether I would be any good at retail or whether I would enjoy it. But it turned out that I certainly enjoyed it, and enough people thought I was good that sometime later I was running that shop and then running all the shops, and then into group roles and chief operating officer by the time of the pandemic, which was another experience entirely. Like a fabulous journey, and I mean, candidly, it's a story that's as much about retail as it was in that era as it is about co-ownership. But both worked together very well during that period for John Lewis, and certainly benefited me.
And how significant was it for you at the time? I'm always interested in why people join John Lewis. Clearly, John Lewis itself and Waitrose makes a big play of the fact that everybody's a partner. Was that a really significant part of what attracted you to the model? And do you feel does it still have the same sort of resonance now when new people are joining the partnership?
It played no role whatsoever in attracting me. I was a student who'd been on a grant, was in debt by the time I left university, and I needed a job. And frankly, had any credible business offered me a job, I would have taken it. Once I was in and begun to understand the depth behind what my mother had always said to me, which is, John Lewis is a good employer, without having any kind of deeper understanding of that. Once I begun to understand what that meant in practice, which for me as a young man was really just about uh, a kind of an esprit de corps, a kind of feeling that this was a small, I was part of a small team, which was part of a slightly bigger team in the store, which was part of a huge corporate team, and that came through very powerfully, aided by which I think is one of the cornerstones of co-ownership is kind of a really enhanced level of communication. So that's how it manifested for me. Over time, I think, like many businesses, that the partnership has kind of waxed and waned a little on how tangible and how compelling the co-ownership inside the business has felt. And I do think it is challenged in an era where it is more difficult to make the economic benefits of that feel regularly impactful and meaningful.
Did they used to essentially demonstrate the added value that you get, the sort of dividend that often is talked about by being employee owned? Was that something that was promoted to the partners in the business?
Very much so, and that probably hasn't changed. But I would say what's happened is that in the environment where I joined the business in the early 90s, the way that John Lewis went about training, developing, communicating, giving voice to partners felt utterly unique and without any even remote comparison anywhere in corporate life in Britain, far less retail. The reality is that many businesses marching under completely different banners than co-ownership have actually, on a perhaps more transactional level, but still meaningful, have upped their game significantly. And obviously technology has changed the game as well when it comes to what we think of as communication and being connected. So again, I'd say that there's less difference on that front for John Lewis, between the John Lewis I joined and the one I left. The differential that represents has definitely been eroded.
Was there a time when you were at John Lewis, you did a big stint where you thought actually start on the shop floor, you'd worked your way up pretty well to the top of the business, that actually you'd just see your days out and retire as a John Lewis partner?
Insofar as I ever gave it any thought, then that was certainly a possibility. I mean, I'm not particularly prone to that type of deep introspection, but when I did, and the pandemic, for example, would be a moment where I think lots of us asked ourselves that sort of question. I actually found that while it was a possibility, I wasn't as comfortable with the idea as I might have thought I would be. But that was much less about the partnership and much more just about how did I want to, once it was all done, once I retired or not an exec anymore, how did I want to look back on it? And it just felt that it would be incomplete if the story was only about John Lewis.
Sure. So, I mean, that's a neat link into the entertainer. How did that all come about? Did you know Gary? I mean, clearly you would have known the business by reputation, but how did the two of you get together, and what was the process there in terms of bringing you in and just getting you to the point where you thought actually this, from I guess a whole load of different perspectives, it was the right next career move for you in the business?
I had resigned from John Lewis, which has been something that, as I've mentioned, I'd begun to think about during the pandemic, and then, as obviously the case for most senior execs, a very long notice period, and so, thought I better get on with this because it could take me a long time to find another job. I had resigned and I was working through a 12-month notice period, and trying to take my time to think broadly and not jump at the first thing that came along, and actually had considered non-exec roles rather than another exec role, and had turned down a couple of exec things that didn't feel right. And I took a call from a headhunter who said, what would you feel about being CEO of the Entertainer? And I said, I have absolutely no thoughts on that whatsoever, because it's just never occurred to me. And although I knew the business, it superficially, I really knew nothing. And as she talked me through it, family run, highly principled, single category, but national and international, has a product business. I thought this ticks pretty much every box that I could imagine for using the skills that I've been honing for 30 years on the one hand, and through international and through the product business and through it being family owned, really adding new challenge and new learning. But to be totally candid with you, all that is irrelevant in a founder-led business, because what's going to happen, and I kind of knew this would be the case, is you're going to walk in a room and you're going to meet another guy who's the guy who founded the business, and he's going to shake you by the hand and look you in the eye. And by the end of an hour and a half, he's either going to like the cut of your jib and trust you, or he's not. And if he doesn't, it doesn't matter what your experience is and how you feel about it, it's not going to happen. So the key moment was not any of my intellectualizing about the job or what I could do or the pack that I put together to present to Gary and his eldest son Duncan. I'm absolutely convinced that it was more about something human that passes between people when they meet and kind of build a rapport.
So he liked the cut of your jib, as you put it. What was the process there? You then had to presumably follow a series of sort of interviews. You get the job. Was Gary at that point was still essentially the CEO? Was he? I mean, he was clearly the founder, but was he running the business at that point?
I think, Gary, I think by that point, the better way to describe what Gary was he was executive chairman. And there had been a CEO prior to my appointment, albeit he had left the business sometime before, and there'd been a kind of interim holding pattern between Gary, Duncan, and a couple of the execs. But in reality, a business can only have one leader ultimately, i.e., the person that everybody knows. If there is a really contentious debate to be settled, how will that get settled? So yes, in that sense, Gary was still running the business, but the agenda that I was being brought in to develop and execute, as Gary will tell you himself, was not specifically a transition to an EOT. It was, the transition has to happen, and it has to happen in the next couple of years, because Kath and I aren't getting any younger, and the retail is a dynamic place that won't stand still. So we need to get on with this. It was a transition of which an EOT, it would be a very attractive version, but at that point it was unexplored. It was unexplored and probably not fabulously well understood. So it was just one of a number of options.
Okay. So how did it work? I'm interested, before we sort of dive in a little bit more into the decision, and obviously I can talk to Gary about that actually ultimately led him to going down the path of employee ownership. But in terms of parallel running with anybody, was that something from a CEO leadership perspective, or were you sort of slightly thrown in at the deep end, and as you said, there is only one person leading the business, and away you went almost as soon as you got your feet under the table?
I mean, I think realistically, I think it would have been experienced by people in the business as a mixture of the two. I was very respectful of the fact that this was a sector of retail that I was not expert in. So there was a lot to learn about the toy industry. There's obviously a lot to learn about the business that you're taking on specifically. And I was also very conscious that whatever Gary said and genuinely wanted in terms of his transition away from the business, that the reality of that might manifest differently for him. And that if that was allowed to accelerate too fast, there may be a bit of buyer's regret on his part about the CEO he'd introduced. So I would say we managed it gently but purposefully in terms of moving it forward. But I think it took at least 12 to 18 months for it really to feel like, for people in the business, that Gary really was like a in the stands cheering on more than in the dugout. What he definitely wasn't was on the pitch.
Okay, that's really, really clear and really helpful. And in terms of when you were joining the business, was it apparent through the conversations with Gary that actually a big change was imminent, albeit at that point Gary wasn't 100% that it was going to go employee owned? Did you, so essentially you signed up to a CEO role to take forward a business that could go through a monumental change within a relatively
Yes.
short period, and you were
That,
comfortable with that? Yeah.
yeah, that was absolutely the premise on which not just I was great. That was the premise of the search, and also, I mean, I guess there was really three parts. There was, look, we've got this business, it's running, it's good, it's, you know, it's, but it needs to be run. We're about to, we hope, and we did sign a deal with Tesco that's going to be transformational for the commercial and financial aspect of the business and operationally. Oh, and by the way, none of this is steady state because, you know, we're approaching retirement age, and our sons don't want to take on the business. So some sort of transition is going to be required, and we'd love it if that was employee ownership. But honestly, we don't know if that's the right or even a feasible answer.
In terms of the idea of this podcast is really to help other people potentially navigate their way through to employee ownership. Not that I think that necessarily employee ownership is the panacea for every business, but in terms of the process that you then followed, I guess very closely with Gary, that led to the decision to become employee owned. What did that look like? Did you look at every option, trade sale, float, you name it, you looked at it? Or did it become very apparent pretty quickly that an EOT was the preferred one for all sorts of reasons, and be interesting just to explore what all those reasons would have been?
Well, I think that the first thing to acknowledge is that there'll be a chapter of the answer to that question that I've never been party to, and it will have started. My sense is it probably started around 2019, 2020 for the Grant family, particularly the pandemic. And again, Gary could speak for himself, but I think it's fair to say it's such a shocking event, such a threatening event for a family-owned business, even a big successful one like the Entertainer, that my understanding is that that was the real moment of we've got to get serious about what we think we're going to do here over the longer term. But by the time that I was involved, the way that the process worked was, I wouldn't describe what we had done as being kind of deep exploration of a range of options. One was ruled out straight away by the family. It was they had no desire to give the sort of energy or commitment that would be required for a float to public markets. They just didn't, and they also didn't really see that the Entertainer was necessarily the sort of business that would be particularly would benefit from that. So that was never on the table. Pretty much everything else was, but I think that, you know, the way I describe it now is that, you know, that the hearts were always hoping that employee ownership would come through as the credible option, and the heads just needed to find out enough information and perspective and experience from others to convince themselves that that was really going to be a practical kind of way forward. But then, honestly, what happened was that the impact of swallowing the Tesco business, as I say, a business almost as big as the business that we were at that time, it basically took all of our energy for 12 to 18 months. And so while it wasn't completely off the table when we did turn to it now and then, it wasn't actually a major focus until around about Q1 last year. I mean, we really did come to it kind of quite late, and then move quite quickly beyond that.
In terms of, did you find at the time plenty of support and advice and guidance to take you through the process? Because certainly when we became employee owned in 2019, it was still, I mean, it was sort of obviously from 2014, there were a growing number of employee owned businesses, but not a significant number. So for us, finding our way through the process, who to appoint from a legal perspective, was that from your side, was that the market sort of more mature and therefore looking to professionals and tax advisors and things that could guide you through the process? Was that a relatively straightforward process for you? And
I think
yeah,
it was, and maybe we were fortunate in that sense. I mean, obviously we're probably slightly larger than the average to transition. And with that, I think probably become a network of senior people on my side and professional services people on the businesses side, where actually it's never too difficult to find a group of guys who either have done or know some people who have done a
Sure.
thing. And so it so turned out that our long-term corporate lawyers actually had a very well developed employee ownership practice, and a good track record. KPMG, who we also use, were good on the tax and ready to roll. Obviously, I had connections into the EOA from my time at John Lewis, so I had a good range of people. Obviously, Patrick Lewis becoming our trust chair is an example of that. Somebody who's guided a couple of businesses through that process, um, and the guys at Richer Sounds as well, who we had connections with. So piecing it together. But I guess what I would say to businesses and founders, or execs who kind of facing the same transition and maybe don't have the benefit of those connections, is first of all, be confident they do exist. And it really is just a question of finding them, and the EOA is frankly the obvious place to
Yeah,
start.
brilliant. So it sounds like a decision was made early to 25. You became officially employee owned in September 25. What was the communication process like with the team? Because you've got a huge number of employees, both in the UK and overseas. At what point were they aware that the Grant family were looking at succession? And did that sort of wobble people from oh my goodness, we know Gary really well, we know what he stands for, his values are really clear, what's happening now? So I'm interested in that, because I think that is a challenge for employee-owned businesses when they start to suspect something's afoot. And I think businesses pick it up pretty quickly. Suddenly a pattern of meetings changes, you've got professionals coming in for meetings and things, and people go, what's going on? So we took the view to let the team know here, as soon as the board had made a clear decision that for us, employee ownership was the only route, we got everybody together and started to socialize what that meant. How did that work in practice for the entertainer with such a large group of what are now employee owners?
So when we think about the 2,000 directly employed individuals at the entertainer, it's helpful to recognise that 1,750 of them basically work in shops or the field. And so the truth is they knew absolutely nothing and would have noticed nothing, other than that at some level it would have been on their mind that, Gary was, 66 and Kath was 68, 69, and that something was probably going to happen at some point. In the head office, there were probably about 20 or 30 people who would have that finger on the pulse awareness, consciously and maybe subconsciously, of what's the mood music, what's the rhythm of the business, who am I seeing a lot of, who am I seeing less of. And for those 20 or 30 people, I dare say there would have been a growing awareness that something may be afoot. But I actually, because we moved quickly and because we were quite decisive, ultimately it was the family obviously who had the decision, and we're quite decisive. Actually, I think it was a pretty well kept secret, and was deliberately so because of the desire to simply keep people focused on the operational commercial activity of the business. And I think I would probably say that while there's a lot to do in transitioning a business, if the principles on which that business has been run are actually fairly sympathetic already to employee ownership, I actually think the transition steps are less profound than most people would probably fear, as they embark on that process.
Sure. And then, so you make the decision, the head office team aware. How did you then make an announcement to those that are, as you say, the vast majority in running the shops? How was that communication dealt with? What was your first sort of communication with them to let them know of this quite significant change to allay their fears?
In a couple of stages, and I mean, just from the kind of teaching aspect of this, insofar as it's useful, we actually did employ a communications agency. So only the second time that the business has ever done that, because we recognised that there were multiple stakeholder groups who needed to be managed through this inside and outside the business. And we didn't have a big enough functional expertise to feel we could confidently manage that alongside everything else. And that was very helpful in structuring that thinking and the drafting, but also just the having an extra couple of pairs of hands around to help drive that forward. The communication internally was a all hands communication in person in the head office, broadcast live across the business, of me making the announcement, followed up by a much more detailed written communication the second that broadcast had concluded, and then with a pre-arranged in diaries, although people didn't know what it was, taking the top 250 people in the business. So that would be every store manager, a good swathe of head office, and every area manager, up to Birmingham to do a full day's communication, which acted also as effectively the baton handing moment, although it wasn't the actual date of the transition. In terms of the internal culture, it was the public moment of the laying on of hands from Gary and the family to myself and the leadership team. And it was a fantastic event. It went incredibly well, but it was incredibly emotional. Emotional.
I mean, I think from the podcasts I've done, I think you're the only firm, because you are a large firm, that have brought in an external communication consultancy, and I can absolutely see the value in doing that. With the benefit of hindsight, was there anything that you'd change in that communication process? I mean, I really like the idea of getting everybody together. I can imagine, having met Gary and the sort of history of the building of the business, what that day must have been like. But yeah, was there anything that you think, actually, we sort of slightly missed a trick there? Or do you feel that it pretty well went to plan?
It's very rare that I find myself saying this, but I honestly think it went as well as it possibly could. There's nothing of significance that I think was a kind of missed facet of how we engaged, or qualitatively could or should have been very different. And as I say, I think if I reflect on, well, why is that? I do think we had some advantages in terms of organizationally understanding what might be involved. But also that cultural sympathy of the way that Gary and his family led the business, the principles that they had, that there was a lot of continuity. So our effort really was very much on the practicalities of the change, and that then allowed space for the emotion and what people felt about Gary's departure to have its own space, which I think was very important. My main fear all the way through was that the practical realities would squeeze out the opportunity for the recognition of what this meant to Gary and the family, and the opportunity for them to leave this as a kind of legacy moment and act.
And then post the big announcements and your live broadcast, essentially, then was that sort of followed up with sort of frequently asked questions documents? Because again, I think, you stand up and talk about we're going to become employee owned. People think, I don't really know what that means. They start to Google, they find tax-free bonuses and things, and there's all sorts of positive and negative stuff out there. Was that the process that you then followed up in terms of, this is actually what it means for the business? Yes, there has been a change, but this is what it means, this is what it doesn't mean. Is that the process you followed up?
That's precisely the process that we followed. The very detailed Q&A, but also further face-to-face opportunities for those questions to be asked, and a lot of emphasis placed in both the proactive and reactive communication on the fact that short term, very little, if anything, will feel different. It will take some time for the architecture of the business or any tangible differences to become visible, and it would probably be one of my top pieces of advice to incoming CEOs or continuity CEOs through that process is, you've got to underpromise. You've got to underpromise very actively, because otherwise I think there's inbuilt disappointment, because it does take time, not to decide that you're going to have a colleague advisory board as we do, not even necessarily to elect people to it, But for that to have meaning that then translates to the rest of the business, that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
That takes us nicely into governance changes. You talked about your colleague advisory board. What were so you established a trust board, you've got your colleague advisory board. How does that ecosystem sort of work together? And I think, again, sometimes when I'm chatting with CEOs who have taken over from an employing business, one of the senses is this going to really slow down the process of decision making? You sort of agility, and I don't think that has to be the case, but it can be, because you can come out of a non-EO board meeting decision made. With a EO business, clearly there'll be reserved matters and other things where the trust board will want to go, actually, we need to sort of dig into that a little bit more. So can you just talk me through the governance post-EO of the entertainer and how that sort of played through for you as a CEO? Have you felt any of those challenges around, I just want to get on, growing and building the business?
I have to say I haven't felt those challenges, and let me describe the structure. So a CEO, the primary part of it is understanding is the relationship that the trust board is going to have with the group board, and because I think Duncan, who is the seller representative, had sat on the group board for years, and both the other two trust directors are formerly John Lewis partners. Patrick, who obviously was CFO and a board director, and Callum Lafferty, who was a member of the John Lewis Partnership Council, so the senior democratic body in the partnership. That, I think, that really helps, because they all innately understood and were very comfortable with the fact that the trust board had some very serious accountabilities when it comes to the spiritual health of the business and the underlying economic kind of fundamentals and management, but we're not a group board. And I think that the potential for confusion of role and accountability between trust board and group board, certainly that was my main anxiety. And that has not been a problem, I'm delighted to say. And the colleague advisory board that we've brought into existence is a 13-person body, where Callum, as the employee trust director, chairs that body. And I think that continuity, that link, is really important. It's something that I felt strongly about coming out of John Lewis, where there is a slight dislocation between the various parts of the democratic representation. And I've got a very great focus on ensuring that employee voice and employee will, that there's one place that we can go to and be really confident that everybody in the organization understands that it represents that voice. And if other people have different opinions, that's fine, but the formally recognized voice only exists in one place. And if it starts to bounce off the walls and echo around, and which is the valid version of employee voice, that's a really tough place to find yourself. So look, it's early days, and I'm a long way from declaring victory on this, but so far I've been very, very encouraged by the enlightened, calm and rational approach that the colleague advisory board have taken. They have led with, I would describe it as curiosity rather than judgment, which is excellent. Particularly for the stage in the process, because there's so much for all of us to understand together about the business and how to work together. I dare say, tougher moments will come, and there may be some delay and kind of doubling back that has to happen as a result of that. But so far, that's not been the case. And across, because we're a big business, the 13 people obviously can't cover the ground. So we also have colleague advisory groups that understand very much that their role is to feed in to the colleague advisory board. So again, there's no separation there. One feeds into the other. And we're probably just getting into our stride of also using that as a two-way communication form, with a kind of enhanced level of communication down the business through those individuals. So far so good, but simplicity and clarity are absolutely my watchwords in thinking about how to architect that.
Sure. Just a couple of questions following on from that. So, my sense is with the main board and the trust board, you've got that great relationship. For again, those that are maybe have established an EOT business or are thinking about it, it is often a source of not friction, but a source of tension, making sure that the trust board know what's going on. Are there any things that any parameters you've put in place or advice you'd give to in terms of cadence of meetings, or just how do you maintain that good relationship between the main board and the trust board? It feels like, as you say, you've only been going a relatively short space of time as an EO business, but it feels like it's running well. And it's, yeah, I just wondered if there was any particular, you'd step back and thought, actually, if we're going to make this work really well, it's got to look like this. Just any general advice for people who are going through a sort of governance restructuring process.
Um, I think the first thing that we did was we all went out for dinner together. And I do think there's something about being understood as people before we then reverse into our board identities. And keeping that going, I think, is going to be important. Um, the the statutory directors of our business, there are three: myself, my CFO Martin, and my chief people officer George. And I'd say that we carry a kind of weekly rhythm of contact with the trust board, which I wouldn't expect to last forever, but through this initial period, that's been really useful. Over the first few months, that was actually meetings or Teams meetings. Now it tends to be more of kind of weekly WhatsApp exchanges in between the formal trust board meetings, which are monthly. We've got probably an aspiration of moving to quarterly trust board meetings. That again, our feeling was that in the first year, we could always cancel a meeting that we didn't need, but there was probably a sense in having more regular contact, as much so people could, the main problem would be feeling that people were being excluded or shut out or kind of hampered in their attempts to create transparency. And so I think, if we're going to be guilty of anything, over communication and over familiarity would be the things to be.
Really helpful. Wish we'd done that. We haven't done a meeting with when we transitioned. We've now got an exec team run by Philippa, the new CEO, who's sort of leading the business. I chair the main board, which is predominantly non-execs, and then we've got the trust board. But the main board and the trust board, I mean, I think we've now found a good rhythm, but we haven't. There's certainly a deeper relationship that we could build through things like having dinners. So that's really helpful. I guess when I first started thinking about the entertainer, and having read a little bit about Gary's background, his faith, probably the values that have been built into that business, it's probably an interesting area to dig into a little bit in terms of, I guess, when I look at Paradigm Norton, the culture here, which I sort of describe as our silent language, is probably a reflection a little bit of me, because I set the business up, and therefore our four core values, which Philippa hasn't sought to change, have sort of carried through from one CEO to another. But with Gary, who's a sort of pretty a charismatic individual who's very clear on what he believes and what he stands for, how has that played out in the context of the business in terms of that continuity of culture and values? Because I am aware that there were certain things that he was uncomfortable for selling in the business. And do you get to the point now when you become employee owned, you take over as CEO, where essentially you just say, I'm now leading this business. It's me that's going to make those decisions. The past is the past, and we're going to move on. How have you navigated that quite tricky, I guess, transition?
I think for most people looking into the entertainer from the outside, that is the $1 million question. I think first of all, I'd say that I've got quite a clear view on what is culturally significant and what isn't, as opposed to what might be commercially significant. So the decision to close the business on Sundays is clearly of huge commercial significance. And if there's one thing that the entertainer would be famous for, I'm sure it would be that. Gary, again, will speak for himself, but Gary understood absolutely that once he transitioned the business to employee ownership, that the rational response to that would be to open on Sundays, and that's what we've done. Equally, some of the products that Gary wished not to stock, we now assess them on their commercial merits. The line that I extract, and this goes back to accepting the job, and I would be pretty confident we'll go back to Gary believing that he wanted to offer me the job, is the headhunter asked me, how do you feel about the fact that they're a religiously oriented business and that Gary has this faith and it pervades the business? And I said, it's really, really simple. I love the fact that they stand for something other than commercial gain. And as long as nobody has a desire to turn the business or me into an evangelical agent of that, I have absolutely no problem at all. I don't share Gary's faith, but I share very, very many of the underpinning principles of his faith and Christianity about how we should treat each other and what we're all here to do. And so those are the things at core that I don't think Gary would say, I am disappointed that they're no longer following Christian teaching. I think we would be devastated if we were no longer following common decency, community investment, feeling that we're here to do good for society and communities and families every bit as much as we're here to make money for the business and the people within it.
And that makes so much sense to me. How was that? Did that come up when we were talking earlier about frequently asked questions? Were there questions raised by employees that perhaps had bought more, not from a faith perspective, but bought more into Gary, that were potentially troubled by the changes that might come along? Was that something that you've had to carefully navigate? And how do you feel 6 months in that that's going?
Yes, I think it's probably helpful to think about the 2,000 people within the business as being made up probably of a couple of hundred who would have felt that they had a personal relationship with Gary, that they really knew him. And so felt all of this, his departure, the changes on a personal level. And 1,800, who would have known who Gary was, but realistically would have felt that he was a leadership figure rather than somebody who kind of his character kind of coloured in their lives. For the 200 who really knew Gary and felt that, his departure was a huge issue and a bigger thought than whatever the end of the sentence that went, and now we're going to become employee owned. It could have been now, pretty much anything, but that they were going to get stuck on was Gary's not going to be here. And so for them, and Gary lent into this personally, it was a very different process, with Gary, spending a lot of time with a lot of those people to try and, respect how they felt about it and not tell them not to feel it, but also to help them see what was going to be good about it and the positivity, and also reassure him that this was good news for Gary and the family, because a lot of people had concern about that, which was, is there something else going on here? Is this in some way bad news and something that Gary regrets? Where it's quite the opposite. Moving forward with the changes to Sunday trading and the things that we stock, I've actually been very, very pleasantly surprised by how little objection at any level there has been to that. In terms of anecdotal response and conversation, everybody very quickly understood that Sundays was just going to be so advantageous to the business commercially. And we are a business full of business people. We're a business full of retailers, and retailers become impatient if they can't do the things that they know will make their business better. So our opt-in rate for Sunday working is about 94-95%. So, huge. And the deal that we've offered for people to work Sundays is a considerate deal. So it's not a disadvantageous deal. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised that it's been well received. The selling of the products, I'd say, I think I can hear in my mind's eye one comment negatively about that, maybe two. in the entire period. And as you might imagine, that's not about the principle, it's more about one specific product. And if I think I'm right, it was actually about Harry Potter, but not on the grounds of the occult, but on the grounds of the individual's feelings about J.K. Rowling.
Interesting.
But which actually was, for me, was kind of perfect illustration of, you just can't manage every sentiment that people have about things in the world.
Yeah, the diversity of thought and opinion. I mean, 2 out of 10, 2,000, that's a pretty good outcome, isn't it? We talked earlier a little bit about go steady was this, I can't remember quite how you phrased it, but in terms of managing expectations when you become employee owned. And I think that's absolutely right. I've done a blog and talk a little bit about the transaction, which is relatively easy, the transition, which you're working on, but actually what you really want is transformation. And that takes time, and you can't push that or rush it. In terms of, quite often when you go to EO events, there's this sort of expression of owner mindset. You want to encourage people to think like owners, think like a partner. I guess, going back to the John Lewis days, that was very much when they did the rebrand to you are now a partner. The idea is that you need to now think differently. You're not just an employee. You're someone who, if you do this or deliver this, the actual impact is bottom line profit, of which you're now going to share. How much has that process started, do you think, across the 2,000 team members in terms of thinking like owners, or is that just a step too far at the moment? You're still in that swirling stage of Gary stepping out, new people coming in. Where are you at on that sort of journey?
In the foothills. I don't think there will be anybody outside colleague advisory board and potentially some of the colleague advisory group members who feel any material shift in their kind of proprietorial ownership of the business. And my own view is that it is liable to take an absolute minimum of 2 years for that to be crystallized. And I do think it requires a repeated cycle of communication feeling different, involvement and engagement feeling different, decision-based outcomes feeling different, and then it's the financial reward that really then locks that in. And we're 2,000 people, 1,700 of those people, maybe not, 1,500 of those people will be on national minimum wage or just above. And I think it's incredibly important in the midst of all the kind of feelings we have about the philosophy and practice of co-ownership, that none of us forget that for the vast majority of people, the energy they can afford to expend on those things are defined by their economic well-being. And only once their economic well-being is taken care of can they really invest in those other things.
Yeah, that takes me to another sort of mantra that we were introduced to in the early days, which is sort of information, influence, and reward. Credit to Campbell MacDonald for introducing that idea to us. But I think you're absolutely right in that if you're providing greater levels of transparency in terms of information, and certainly we're doing that, the influence coming from you're now an employee owner, you're a partner in the business, so start to think like an owner. If you're not providing significant reward, lots of people say, I just want to do my job really well, and there was no change pre-2019 for us, post-2019. I love financial planning, I love clients, I just want to come in and do a good job. But I think, it's a bit like a three-legged stool. I think you've got to have all those three things working well together. But I do like the fact, I was going to ask you, when you talked about you see it as a 2-year process, what the strategy was for that. But you've articulated that in terms of communication and just reminding people of the decision that was made. That was really clear. Would you be anticipating that the business potentially could perform better as a result of becoming employee-owned? There's a lot of research out there that says employee-owned businesses retain team members for longer, performance is better, profits are enhanced against other non-EO businesses. Would that be a expectation you'd have longer term?
I wouldn't rule it out, but the business Gary built already had a lot of those characteristics. Tenure in the entertainer is significantly longer than the retail average. The esprit de corps that I referred to earlier has always been strong within the business. I think post-pandemic that maybe staggered a little, but I think we're getting back into our stride on that now. And so I think what I would say is that for the entertainer, co-ownership certainly has the potential to sustain and solidify its cultural and financial strength. And were our business to have come from a different place, I would definitely be one of those advocating for the thought that employee ownership can bring those benefits. But as you said early on, perhaps most importantly, it is never, I don't think it's ever a panacea. It's like any other philosophy, you're effectively making a choice of a certain set of strengths and weaknesses, a certain set of opportunities, and recognizing that there are trade-offs and downsides is a really important part of it.
Does Gary have any team-facing role at all to play now in terms of the transition, or have you deliberately not sidelined him? I know that wouldn't be your style or what would be intended, but is he now just enjoying retirement and he was the figurehead and that's no longer the case, or are there times when you could see it's important to sort of bring him back out for that sort of corporate memory?
I wouldn't for a minute say that could never happen, but he and I both felt that he pervaded the business to such an extent for so long that anything other than complete, cold turkey, if you like, only ever possibly give rise to confusion, and that we wanted to avoid that at all costs. So I still see Gary semi-regularly. We're actually going to go out and visit a few shops in a couple of months' time together. But that is mainly because I value his advice and perspective, and because we have a personal relationship that I want to maintain. But I do think that for at least the first 18 months, I want there to be real clarity to everybody in the business that the leadership comes from one place, and that, in their minds, Gary's off enjoying his retirement. In fact, what he's doing is running himself into the ground, raising money for charities, but that's what he wants to choose to do now.
Brilliant. That's been really helpful, and I think really helpful for lots of other businesses listening into this podcast. Are there any areas, Andrew, as you came onto the podcast today, around employee ownership within the entertainer that we haven't yet covered, that you think it would be remiss if we didn't cover? Is there anything, I guess, slightly unique or special, or you've done something that perhaps other businesses haven't done? I mean, you've provided huge insights in all sorts of areas around communication, the way the board and the trust board work together, which is excellent to hear. But was there anything that you think, oh, Barry's inevitably going to ask me that, and we haven't covered it?
No, in all that you've described there are only two things that popped into my head on the not covering it. I did wonder, and I have been asked this elsewhere, about the differences between the way that John Lewis practices kind of it calls it democracy, and the way that we're doing it. But the other one that was the first thing that came into my mind was the extent to which the financial stakeholders of the business don't understand employee ownership and the assumptions that they make about it. So, and it would for CFOs and CEOs as well as founders, that would be something that I would point to, is don't assume that employee ownership transitions are well understood by your bank, by your funding partners, by your lenders, by credit insurers. If you're a retailer, they are actually quite fearful of what they might be. Has the founder just extracted a huge amount of money now, and is this business still creditworthy, for example? And that was something that, although we planned to communicate with those groups, and in the case of the bank, obviously we were taking it through them, on a day-by-day basis, we were still surprised by the amount of kind of rearguard action we had to fight to no, it's not what you think at all. And, actually having to take them through line by line to show them what had happened. But again, those are the only two things that occurred.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Just bringing up that whole subject of the funding, the deferred consideration, and all those issues are quite complex. And certainly in the early days for us, we were given some quite misleading advice, and we suddenly thought it can't possibly work like that. And you dig into it a little bit more, and it wasn't like that at all. So no, that's really helpful. And equally, I agree, mainstream banks have got a lot to learn. There are some lenders, as you've quite rightly said with the EOA, a great opportunity to get both sort of legal and tax advice, but also, there's a number of funding sources that you can access through contacts at the EOA that we've definitely on our journey found particularly helpful. So that's really good. Towards the end of the podcast, there's a few standard questions that I ask every guest. I don't know whether you've listened to one of my podcasts before, but there's just a couple of quick fire questions. So finish the sentence, Andrew. Employee ownership is?
A learning journey full of possibilities.
My biggest EO surprise was?
How quickly people got on board with the idea of a journey, the destination of which is unclear.
Brilliant. I started off by asking people about. I'm quite a keen book reader, and I read probably too many business books, really. And there are some excellent books out around employee ownership. Simon Morton, who's been on my podcast, has written an excellent book about employee ownership. But are there any particular books that you've read in the past that have really influenced your, you've just thought, actually, that's absolutely brilliant, really timely, and has helped you to sort of navigate what has been a hugely successful exec career, both at John Lewis and The Entertainer? Anything that particularly springs to mind?
In the EO sense?
No, just generally. Well, it could be EO, or more generally, just a book that you've read that really has had a sort of profound impact on you. And no worries if that's not been the case.
No, it's Shoe Dog by Phil Knight.
Oh, okay. Tell us a little bit about Shoe Dog.
Phil Knight founded and ran Nike, and it's about his journey from being a aspiring high quality amateur athlete in the US in the 60s, with a desire to constantly innovate the footwear that he was using to get better and better times, and his partnership with a coach and mentor that was central to that. But then I think particularly his experience of the different cultures across the US, Europe, and particularly Japan that he engaged in to develop his business, and the centrality of cash flow for a small young business. But there's lots in there, and it's a very good read.
Brilliant. I'll put that in the show notes. Thank you. One final thing is we call it the CEO confessional or the leadership confessional, and you have some choice here. So the first one is a moment of honesty. That could be a decision you regret or a moment of self-doubt. So you just choose one. So the first one's a moment of honesty. Second one is an unfiltered story. So that could be a time when you've had to fire someone that you like, or a difficult setback for the company. Or the third one is a secret struggle. A few people in the EO space have talked about imposter syndrome. How did I ever get to run a business of 2,000 people or whatever? Balancing work or family, the pressure of being a public face of a company. So moment of honesty, an unfiltered story, or a secret struggle. Anything that particularly resonates?
Well, one thing occurs that I think straddles at least two of them. So there's a lot of ADHD in my family, both in the generation above me and the generation below, and I think I may be not too distant from that myself. And the way my brain works is that I work very intensely for relatively short spurts, and then I need to unhook my brain. I find that very difficult if I don't have something really diverting to do. So I do quite often play chess in board meetings, just in a kind of 1 minute lull of debate, and which sounds ridiculous and like deeply unprofessional. but I actually discovered about 4 or 5 years ago that it's a really, really effective way for me to move my focus from one thing to the other, but stay really sharp. And I now swear by it. I mean, I don't actually do the chess thing very often, but I recognize in myself that if I don't allow myself to actively, it's not stop focusing on something. It's, for me, it has to be, I've been focused on this very big, important business issue. Now I need to be equally focused on something trivial, and then I can move on to another really big, very important business issue. So yeah, and I actually like the individual character that leaders bring to boards and their roles, and I'm very much opposed to kind of cookie cutter approaches to team building or how a job should be done. So I think it's probably therefore okay to share that I play chess in board meetings.
Amazing. What a wonderful way to finish the podcast. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a first on Steak and Soul. Not found anyone else playing chess in a board meeting, but thanks for your honesty and insights. And obviously, in terms of the business has only been employee owned for a relatively short period, but you bring a huge corporate career to the entertainer, and I'm sure it'll only go from strength to strength under your leadership, Andrew. So thanks for your time. Really appreciate that, and have a good rest of the day. I'm sure you've got meetings starting in the next 5 minutes, so really appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Many thanks. Take care.